All right, so we are here now with Senator Frances Lankin, and thank you very much, Senator, for joining us today. Really appreciate your giving your time to speak to us. Just wanted to start off with thoughts on where you see what you see as the most important function of the Senate in Canada.
Well, I think the best reference I can make is to a Supreme Court decision. I think it was in 2014, and it was when Prime Minister Harper made a reference to the Supreme Court to determine whether or not the country could move to an elected Senate as opposed to an appointed Senate. And the Supreme Court set out.
It's okay. I hit the wrong button there. It's okay. Go ahead, please.
Okay. We got a set of criteria, almost like a job description for the Senate coming from the Supreme Court. Mm. And it set out very clearly a number of key principles that have been part of the Senate since its inception. But these are things that we need to remind ourselves all the time, particularly now as we're going through a cultural change in the Senate. But those criteria were, first of all, we must remember that this is an appointed chamber, not an elected chamber, and we're not there to compete with elected parliamentarians. They are the accountable chamber to the people, and that accountability is held with the reins of elections, votes, governments being elected and defeated, etc. The Senate, on the other hand, is to be a complementary body. And you'll often hear people use these words about it is the chamber of sober second thought. Now, MPs don't like that because it makes us sound elevated in comparison, and it shouldn't. But our job is different. So our job is to look at bills that come from the House of Commons that we can pick apart with different perspectives, perhaps, than what the House of Commons considerations were. So we look at the issues of, is it compliant with our Constitution? Is it charter compliant? Are there differential regional impacts in this country of this legislation that we should know and understand and spell out, and if unintended, bring forward amendments to fix? Are there differential impacts on minority populations? And I'm using the word minority writ large. Most particularly within that, we are charged with the responsibility of ensuring that we're engaging with and understanding the impacts on First Peoples, on Indigenous populations, Métis and Inuit, and with respect to other minority populations as well, and whether those are racial minority populations or whether they're LGBTQ populations. What is the impact of this bill? And more and more, we're also doing what's called a GBA plus, a gender-based plus analysis to ensure that the bill doesn't have any unintended consequences, and it takes that all into effect. So, that's the general mandate. When I think of what the most important role of the Senate is, it is to take the time, and this next sentence is important because I'll talk about reform of the Senate as we go on in this interview. It's to take the time and to try to peel away the partisan interests with which elected politicians bring their party platforms, to the fore in the work that they do. And those platforms are representative of views of Canadians, right across the spectrum. So that's an important process. But the Senate, and more as we are going through this process of reform, our job is to step back and to look at it not with the perspective of, this particular senator, Frances Lankin, believes in this policy, and this government's bringing forward a policy that I don't agree with. That's not enough for me to vote against that. And that's not well understood by people. It's not my policy preference. The elected chamber has done something. Our job is to look on all the categories and criteria I mentioned to ensure that that we're in compliance. There's no differential negative impacts. And to also, look at, can the bill be improved along the lines of what the government or the House of Commons final product is that they send to us to review. Lastly, and this has become more difficult as the timetable seems to be crunched more and more for the work to be done by Senate committees. But lastly, we actually look at legislative drafting too. You would be amazed at how many bills come with mistakes in the bill, the numbers, the reference to other parts, a clause that affects substantially another piece of legislation that wasn't considered. So that's part of our job too. So that second sober thought, looking at it again with particular goals in mind to ensure that the legislation is in good form and that it will serve the needs of Canadians as was intended by the House of Commons when they passed the final bill and sent it to the Senate.
Mm-hmm. All right. Now we think about it. Now you've been in the Senate for 6 years now. Have you seen the role of the Senate change in the last several years? And I'm thinking about that idea of moving away from sort of a partisan body or representing certain partisan beliefs. Have you seen some changes, and what are those changes like?
Yeah, it is an institution in transition, and there's no doubt about that. And one of the things I have to say, having come from a provincial government experience in my past to Ottawa, things move glacially slow here. I don't quite understand the reasons for it. I mean, any change management project in a large organization, an institution, is going to take time, and this has. But back in, I think, 2016 or so, the government of the day and the Prime Minister decided that they felt it was worthy to take on a project to help the Senate grow into a more independent institution. So less partisan, less reliant on, a practice of repeating the speaking notes from the other place. And the other place, by the way, it's a quaint way here in Ottawa that the House of Commons refers to the Senate and the Senate refers to the House of Commons. I mean, the first time I stood up and I said, well, the House of Commons, I was, corrected. It's the other place. Some things do take a long time to change. So, but the goal was for it to be more independent. And the first thing the Prime Minister did was remove the Liberal Senate caucus from the National Liberal caucus. He did it without much ceremony, and there were a lot of very upset Liberal senators at the time. But that was an important move, and that group grew into becoming an independent group within the Senate, even though their roots were in the Liberal Party and the National Caucus. The Conservative Caucus, who is the opposition, because the opposition mirrors what's going on in the House of Commons as a result of an election, they have remained very opposed to more independence in the Senate, and they're very committed to the partisan politics. But in 2016, the Prime Minister appointed the first group of new senators who were not being named to go into the caucuses that exist, and instead were independent. And I was one of the first 6. We were 7 of us, actually. We were brought in at the same time, and since then there have been 50 more or so over the time, with retirements and etc., with those seats being filled. That brought about the emergence of a group called the Independent Senators Group. The former Liberal caucus became the Progressive Senators Group and has people other than former partisan Liberals in it now. And a breakaway group from the Conservative caucus and some people who were of more small c conservative leaning, I'm not talking partisanship in this case, came from the other two groups, and they formed the Canadian Senators Group. So there are now 3 independent groups and 1 political partisan caucus and a very small government representative office. So instead of having a government caucus now, there's a representative office. Those were the kind of the structural pieces that brought about the beginning of change. When I got the call from the Prime Minister, if I can share back a secret, I mean, it won't be a secret to many. I was an active New Democrat politician, and New Democrats have generally believed in abolishing the Senate. And it we've got as many resolutions on the books back then about reforming the Senate. So I was interested. This was an opportunity with the constitutional requirement, to have Quebec on side with reforming or a move to abolish, let's say, the Senate, because it's set out in the Constitution. We're not going to have that. It's not going to happen. At least I don't believe in my lifetime. And so reforming the Senate, I thought, was an honorable goal. I asked the Prime Minister, well, what do you mean by independent? And he gave me the right answer. He said, that's for the Senate to decide. That's for senators like you, who we will be appointing more and more independents to shape the future of the Senate in collaboration with the senators that are already there. And that sounded like a challenge for me, and that's what I love. So I went there. 6 years later, I thought I would stay for 3 to 4 years and that we would be well on the road to reform. I'm at 6 years, and we're not there yet, but we are making progress. So there is much less partisanship. There's still one partisan caucus, and you'll still hear the exact same arguments in the House of Commons as they put forward in the Senate. You will still see that they behave, they use the rules of the Senate in ways to delay a bill or whatever, in line with what the official opposition in the House of Commons are trying to do. But the other groups have staked out a turf of independence. That means that any one of us in our group can support a bill, can reject a bill. But remember, I said there are criteria on which we should be operating in the Senate, not just because you don't like the policy, but we're not bound by any caucus discipline. And so it, I think, brings a much richer kind of discussion and consideration. And the Canadians who have been appointed since my appointment in 2016 are from all walks of life from across the country, and bring a really diverse set of backgrounds, interest, experience, expertise to many of the discussions that I think elevates. The other last thing, there's lots I could talk about with this, but the other thing that I think has been very important is the receptivity of the government. There are many more amendments made to bills now that go back to the House of Commons. If we amend a bill, by the way, the process is it then has to be sent back to the House of Commons to be approved. If we approve a bill from them, it then gets enacted. So there are many more amendments, so many more bills going back to the House of Commons. And in a majority government, the government will determine if they'll be accepted. In a minority government, there'll be negotiations there. But not all amendments are accepted, but many of them, a very high percentage of them. And I think that has started to change the dynamic between the House of Commons and the Senate as well.
Right. Okay. And I'm thinking of that phrase, the chamber of sober second thought, which it's a well-used.
Don't focus
phrase.
On the sober part. That's not.
Yeah. It's a well-used phrase, and certainly, I've been around since I think Sir John A. Macdonald. But you think about that idea of keeping government accountable, scrutinizing legislation, suggesting improvements or amendments. Do you have an example of a situation where the Senate's involvement really helped to influence and shape a piece of legislation in a very positive way?
I think of the first couple of major bills I dealt with when I came to the Senate. I arrived in the Senate just before the bill on the legalization of cannabis came. And not long after that was the first of two bills, and I think a third one will be coming, on medical assistance in dying. Both very, very big policy shifts in the country, ones that have a long history of court challenges and other issues that build up a momentum to support that kind of legislation. The Senate in both of those cases actually broke with its normal tradition of how it had dealt with bills, and really did develop a much more collaborative and an in-depth, look at the legislation, deliberative debate and deliberative study that I think was very important. Now, let me use the medical assistance in dying. And both of those bills were of extreme interest to me because I had been Minister of Health in Ontario. But in medical assistance in dying, there were some key issues in the government's first bill that many of us thought it was questionable about whether it would survive a court challenge on charter rights. So the issue of someone whose only presentation of an illness was one of a mental illness of some sort. If that mental illness, made them not competent to make health decisions for themselves, that's pretty clear in that situation. Right. There's provincial legislation about substitute decision making, etc. But where it is something where people describe the anguish of their lives and whatever, that was not deemed in the legislation to be a category to which the definition of suffering and there's specific words around that. The other piece, and this was very much of concern to me, and even in the second bill, this has not been corrected. It's under a special committee, joint committee study right now, and we may see a third bill coming forward. But the whole issue of being able to give an advance directive. So when you think of medical assistance in dying, and if it meets you meet the criteria and you're eligible, and that's judged by health professionals, you can make arrangements for that medical assistance. And the court cases, there's fascinating court cases on this that set out the reasons why someone should have that charter right to make that decision. In the case where you are, let's say you are a senior, and many of us as seniors want to have assurances that our advance requests are going to be respected. Excuse me. So if I want to do not resuscitate, or I don't want any heroic efforts to put me on oxygen or a feeding tube, I just want to, die peacefully, you want those to be respected. They currently are, if you are in a state of mental competence, there's a whole bunch of tests for that, to be able to give that directive, then the doctors and your family must abide by that. Well, many of us believe that the same thing should be true. You should be able to make an advance directive if you at some point in time become non-competent to make the decision for yourself about medical assistance in dying. And the legislation doesn't allow that right now because it has a requirement that you have to agree again shortly before the event that, in fact, you still agree with it. And if you are no longer competent and you're relying on your advance directives, that's not a possibility. There are some other things, but those issues were surfaced by the Senate in depth. We did pass the legislation, but with reservations about whether that would survive a court challenge. We didn't have enough to know to actually say, no, this is non-compliant. But we signaled. The second bill came along. They still didn't, bring that forward. And the kind of review that they did, they got some health academics to do a review, but they didn't have recommendations. They didn't allow them to make recommendations. So we pushed back again. Now there's a joint committee of the House of Commons and the Senate studying these particular issues that were omitted from the bill. And I think we may see some progress on it at this point in time. That's an incredibly important role, and I think the Senate can largely be credited with having pushed the issue.
That's great. So we'll talk about you and your role a little more. You've had a remarkable career. Politician, cabinet minister, president and CEO of United Way, Toronto co-chair of a government review on social assistance, and a lot of other things as well. And of course, last 6 years, a Canadian senator. You've got a track record for speaking up for the rights of the marginalized and for really connecting and communicating with Canadians. Can you talk about your experience, how your experience has been broadened and shaped by your role as a senator, and what this means to you and to the role of senator in the future?
Yeah, let me talk from the personal perspective first. This has been a fascinating experience. I mean, first of all, I came in with a goal around assisting in the development of a more independent Senate. And so I've spent a lot of time working on that. And, the barriers and the blocks that are in your way and the difficulty of cultural change management is something that I've been interested in and, have worked in years. When I was the head of United Way, for example, we did massive change of the orientation of the organization. So, that's a particular leadership challenge that I find, really rewarding. on the policy side, what's really interesting is I've spent all my time at local community and at the provincial level primarily. And, the federal government was there. They were either a funding partner, a transfer partner, or they had a jurisdiction and we couldn't do anything without the feds doing it or whatever. Now, living in Ottawa is a very different, working in Ottawa. I don't live here. I just come here, but it's a very different experience than being in the provincial government. I have a frog in my throat today. Sorry about that.
No.
So, really broadening my own personal knowledge and experience of how government works. I mean, I saw it all through a provincial lens before, and I now see it through both of those lenses. So that has helped me grow in my understanding of the democracy in our country, and in being a practitioner at both levels. That's been I think an important development. I also I do a lot of casework on behalf of Canadians, but I do it on behalf of people from right across the country. Even though I'm a senator for Ontario, a lot of my calls come from Ontario. A lot of them come from people who had dealings with me or who remember, when I was in the provincial government. And they come from all over the province, as opposed to in the past where I had a constituency, right, a riding that I represented. And so the breadth of issues from people's lived experience and the concerns they have and that they bring forward is much broader than I would have experienced just in a downtown urban Toronto riding that I represented electorally many years ago. So it has broadened my perspective as well. But I think the thing that's the most gratifying to me is that all of my career opportunities over the years, I worked, as a negotiator in the trade union movement. I was in politics at Queen's Park, as you referenced, the commissions that I've been involved with, and other projects. It's like they're all layering stones. And, you bring all of that life experience with you, and it shapes your perspectives. And at the same time, I think the kind of work that we do, and particularly when I'm able to do it now in this nonpartisan way, which is my preference. Even when I was a partisan politician, I worked across the floor to try and accomplish things. I think what this allows is a more disciplined approach in embracing cognitive diversity. So when I sit down with someone, I really want to understand why they think the way they do about a policy issue. What is it in their experience? And I want to understand what I don't mean this in a negative sense, baggage, but what has my life experience brought that shapes my perspective? And neither of those things are probably all true or all false or whatever. There are a myriad of ways in which people interact with public policy and governments and in their lives. And I think I am much better at hearing, at listening, at reaching out, at bridging divides, and at trying when there is a problem that seems like you can't solve it, at trying to break out of the boxes and find a different approach. It's not just about negotiation, compromise, horse trading. Well, you do that and I'll do this, and you get that and I'll get that. It's about, can we combine the multitude of perspectives, embrace that cognitive diversity in life experience, which is true among all of us, and it's even more true where we come from other countries or we come from other cultural backgrounds, we're Indigenous, etc. Try to find a way to break through and find a different solution that builds on the best of all of those ideas. And I get to work on that here when I'm doing policy work, and I get to continue to practice, being that kind of a listener and bridge builder. And that's very, very gratifying for me.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I don't have any other...
I guess I should just say last, because you asked about the Senate itself.
Yeah.
I think, so it's been very gratifying for me. I think that the vast majority of senators there now are independent. People have their, that doesn't mean I don't have the same value set that I've had all my life, that on an ideological basis I'm not far from where I was on the spectrum, but it is not my job is not party first, as it
Right.
would be in electoral politics. And
Right.
I think the majority of senators are embracing that. It makes for some rough go and some tensions for the government in terms of, is their bill going to get passed or not? These are all independents. There's no herding the cats.
Right.
But I think it's a very important development, and one that in the long run will make the Senate of Canada a much more valuable institution to Canadians, much more value for the taxpayer dollar that supports it, and one that brings the original sense of regional balance to the discussions, and of quieter, less noisy in the media partisan approach to thinking the issues through. And I believe that that's only good for Canadian democracy.
Yeah. Wonderful. Thank you. I don't have any other questions, but I do thank you very much. Greatly appreciated. And yes, thank you again.
Well, you're welcome. I'm delighted to do this, and it's so nice to connect with you again from the way back days when I was Minister of Economic Development and Health, and all of those great speeches that you prepared for me. I was always one of those ones that didn't like reading speeches, but yours were great, so thank you very much.